Well, welcome. This is Marsha Sinetar again, and I'm so happy to be introducing you to our guest, Dr. Joseph Rabb, Professor of Religious Studies and Theology at Siena Heights University in Adrian, Michigan. There's a longer biographical sketch of Dr. Rabb at the end of this interview, but I thought because it's somewhat dated, I'd introduce him to you this way at the very beginning. Something came to mind as I was talking with Joe, something that he said about his own spirituality. And it had to do with the idea that I've written about having to do with our spiritual fingerprint. The fact that each of us is unique in the way we dwell or abide with the Father. And the verse in John 14:2, where Jesus says, "In my Father's house are many mansions." This verse has been kind of rolling around in my mind for many, many years. And a light bulb went on as Joe was talking, which I think sort of leads me to say that these conversations are as valuable for me as I hope they are for all of you who listen. But at any rate, after the conversation, I went to my expository dictionary of New Testament words. The one I use is by Vines, V like Victor, I-N-E-S. And I looked up the word mansions, and the definition, surprisingly to me, does not have to do with separate abodes or structures, but it has to do with what I understand as a mode of abiding, a staying place. So in other words, we each have a way of dwelling with the Father. It's like in the 91st Psalm, where we read, "I dwell under the shelter of the Most High, and I abide in the secret place." Okay, I think each of us has that little way, slightly different from someone else, of abiding with God. And I don't think this contradicts in any way Jesus' statement later on in the same chapter, chapter 14, John, verse 6, where he says, "I am the truth, the way, and the life." The mansion seems to me, from what I read in the definition, a mode of abiding, a mode of staying with. So there's one house, as we read in, I guess it's Corinthians, first book, I think, where Paul says, he's talking about the Father's house. There's one house. And for Christians, at least, there's one way to the house, to the one house. But within that house, there are many, many ways, infinite number, I would imagine, ways of dwelling, modes of dwelling. And that's what this conversation reminded me about. Now, I also want to say I'm in vitro in all of this. I'm evolving my own understanding, as we all seem to be. Clarity unfolding as the Holy Spirit moves us. And I am open to your interpretation. So having said that, I want to welcome again our guest to the conversation. I wish you the best as always, and don't forget to stay tuned. At the end of our conversation, you'll hear those biographical notes. Thanks again for being with us. I want to welcome you to a conversation I'm going to be having with a much respected long-distance colleague, Professor Joe Rabb. And Joe and I are going to be talking about self-styling, a contemplative experience, let's say a weekend, probably no longer than a weekend. And without further ado, Joe, it strikes me in talking with you several times that you have a real heart for contemplative issues. And I know that you've had some contemplative experience, so maybe you could just tell us, by way of introduction, how you've come to get interested in these themes.
Well, that's a very good question, and not one I've been asked before. I think I have to go back to when I was 16 years old. I participated in something called Outward Bound, which was a kind of, outdoor education camp. And part of that experience was something they called the solo experience, where you were left to your own devices for 3 days.
Wow.
In the woods, basically, with little more than, a Viz Queen tarp and a sleeping bag. And actually they, instructed us not to do any reading or to have any other kind of distractions around us. And
right.
I was initially excited to do that, but partway through it, I just became utterly terrified.
Right, I can imagine.
And I was not prepared at all for it. But
and this was in the wilderness of some sort?
Yeah, this was in the boundary waters on the Canadian border with Minnesota.
Wow. I know that area.
It's
rugged.
Beautiful.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
And rugged, yes.
Very rugged. Yeah, I know Outward Bound. I remember hearing about it.
Yeah, it's a great program, and I am very grateful for having had the experience.
Right.
But at that young age, I was I encountered some questions I had never had before, kind of like, who am I, and where do I come from, and what makes me me, and what's life all about, and but it was a baptism by fire.
Absolutely.
And it was one that left me feeling mostly afraid and mostly fearful after the experience, but something about it became a kind of haunting for me that made me always want to explore those types of experiences further, just because it was precisely in those environments that you could really do the kind of self-examination and ask those questions about what gives my life meaning and who am I.
Exactly. And it's very spiritual, even though there's no trapping of religion around it. It just immediately, the philosopher Max Picard, you remind me of something that he said. He has this book about silence, I think it's called. I'll think of it later, but he talks about silence being very creative and very radical if you're in it long enough and in the right way, and you must have been.
Well, I don't know. Something got stuck in me. I do remember, even in that short time, quickly boiling down to some essential affirmation that life, the meaning of life, was tied to love and loving relationships, and that became a truth and a clarity for me that has never waned and never that I've never lost appreciation for.
Right. That's a beautiful thing. There is that, in that loneliness or solitary place, whether we're in the wilderness or in our cell, so to speak. It's that reverence for life that you're talking about, in the best sense. And sometimes it can be an oppressive silence too, like you say. Fill us with fear and so forth.
Right.
And I guess what I'm thinking about is so much tamer than that, because when we self-style a weekend for ourselves, we're usually at home or in a hotel or.
Yeah.
I'm not thinking about a formal retreat where you'd have people around to guide, but rather one negotiates to be alone for some period of time. So how would you, getting right to the crux of it, how would you advise someone that hadn't done this before?
Well,
or would you?
I don't know. I think, recently I did a contemplative experience that you helped me with, and I think we made some progress there. One important feature of a contemplative experience that's going to last a couple of days in quiet and fairly solitary circumstances it's nice to have some rhythm, some even fairer structure to follow, and some resources that would help in the guiding of your meditations.
Right.
Because the contrast to that is kind of what I experienced in Outward Bound, which was really frightening, and I don't think it has to be frightening. I think it can be very lovely and beautiful, and sometimes a little structure helps with that.
Yeah, and as you're talking, I'm thinking, today, I don't know if that program could exist. I don't know if it does exist, and with all the attention to sort of comforting our children, not exposing them to too much trauma, I would say, is this the wisest course? But as I remember Outward Bound, and this is kind of, we're getting off the subject, but it still helps to frame what we're talking about. I remember Outward Bound being almost a precursor to something that one would do before going into the Peace Corps or something. It was very much for the young person that had that open heart for experience, what I mean?
Right, adventure, yes.
So you must have been a very special young man. I mean, really, to take on that kind of thing.
It was something that it definitely was attractive to me, the adventure and all of that.
Yeah.
But that's some of the great philosophers and spiritual writers say the greatest frontier now is the interior life.
Yeah, definitely.
And that's what the contemplative experience or contemplative retreat introduces you to, that frontier of the interior landscape.
Right. Well, what kind of preparation would you, instead of giving the unknown person advice, what kind of preparation did you do for your own retreat or weekend or whatever?
Well, I just, in one way, I thought about things, especially sources that I knew from experience to be nourishing and challenging, and that I hadn't been able to spend time with, the kind of time that would be necessary to really harvest some fruit from.
Right.
And so I, carefully selected a few things, and also looked forward to things that you had suggested that I would not have thought of. And the combination of the two was really wonderful. I mean,
can you give us an idea of which resources were helpful, whether you brought them or whether they were there for you?
Well, the ones that I did not bring with me that ended up being really powerful for me were the Way of the Pilgrim, and that kind of coupled with the short piece on Mount Athos.
I just love that.
Yeah, that was really a great combination, the two of those together, which just reminded me of how the mindfulness exercises of the Jesus Prayer really can carry the kind of contemplative awareness into your everyday life. If you can continue to be centered, outside of the retreat, the retreat venue.
Right.
And that's a beautiful thing.
It's a beautiful thing. For those who are listening to us talk, the Mount Athos DVD really is an excerpt or the whole thing, I'm not sure what it was, from the 60-minute report on the monks at Mount Athos. It's the oldest monastery, I guess, in the Western world at least. And I was struck when I watched it, and I've watched it several times, by the purity of their intent.
Yes.
And I guess if and when I self-style a retreat, now I live in a pretty contemplative way, but the day is very fractured. It's broken up. I try my best not to have interruptions in the early morning. In fact, I rarely do. But it's still so distracting. Everything we do is just, it takes you away from that focus, as you say, on whatever prayers you're doing, Jesus prayer, or I know Merton talks about variations on that theme. And he says you could just say, Christ have mercy. So it's a shorter version of the prayer.
Right.
But I guess what I was going to say is that I was struck by their intent. It was beautiful. It was a beautiful thing.
It is. I think it's Kierkegaard who says that purity of heart means to will one thing.
Right.
And you really see that in the whole dynamism of that community, really being centered on adoration and prayer, and it's it's so striking that everything revolves around that center.
It's a beautiful thing. I wondered how you felt, and I guess this is, again, we're straying a little bit from the issue, but I don't think so. I think in a way it all revolves around one thing, which is to live that God-centered. It's not just living a God-centered life in theory, but it's really willing or being with God and God with us 24/7, as I say. So I wondered how you felt when you heard that one monk whose father died, say that they don't go to any funerals. He didn't attend the funeral.
Right.
How did that strike you?
Well, that's when I knew I was not called to be a monk.
Mm-hmm.
My brother is a monk, and I know that's part of the vow of stability. And I understand it and actually respect it, but that's really not my spirituality, in the sense that obviously at some point I think the life of faith requires some either-or options.
Right.
But in that case, that's not. I don't know. It's just. But again, I haven't taken those vows. Yeah, I think you see it differently when you do. Yeah.
Exactly, and I do think that our life, if we're living rightly, it is a vocation of sorts. No matter whether we're householders, parents, teachers. I probably have more of the monk temperament. Probably, if I had taken vows, I probably, like Merton, at some point I would have requested to live in a hermitage. I do have that temperament.
Because you do already, right?
I do already. I have a lot of contact with day-to-day living friends, the running of a household, the outreach, teaching, but that's my life. Family, my way of being is very hard on a family. Very hard. They don't really understand it, but they love me, so they put up with it. And that's what it is. It's a putting up with. And I'm sure a lot of raised eyebrows. But let's segue into something that I have also wanted to talk to you about, because it will relate to our conversation completely. And since you are a professor and you are with young people and people of all ages, how would you talk to them about contemplative issues or the contemplative life? And now especially as I know what introduced you to the whole theme. What would you tell them about, cautions or idealism or intent?
Well, I think that that to many of my students, the idea itself is bizarre.
Yeah. Especially today.
In fact, I did show the Mount Athos piece to a class of undergraduates, and they reacted strongly to the monk who would not leave to go see his father. And then they took that to a place of, well, some of these people might just be wasting their time. They're not doing the works of Jesus. They're not out doing the corporal works of mercy.
Right.
And so I think that contemplation needs to be presented to the students not as a waste of time, not as a diversion from their daily life, but as something absolutely essential to grounding their daily life and to providing a foundation for a meaningful life. And I usually can move them to that space when I begin to ask them questions about, when is the last time you really spent time alone without any distractions? How long was that time? How long could you go before you turned on the TV or the radio or text messaged or and usually it's, unless they were sleeping, it's only a matter of a few minutes.
And
and then I invite them to go further.
Yeah, as you're talking, I'm thinking, well, first the thought that some young people, if not many, now sleep with their cell phone by their side or their iPads or whatever they use, the iBook, iPhone. But the other thing has to do with this matter, and this relates to the first part of our discussion, settling down in the first place. I mean, you walk into a room, whether it's a cell of prayer or a hotel room or whatever, you walk in a room and you don't automatically run to pray.
Right.
There's a period of, it's almost like a little animal. You know how a cat will, or dog, they'll turn around and around and around, and they'll try and figure out, where am I going to be comfortable here? What did you do to settle down, or were you in need of a kind of acclimation?
Well, I was looking forward to it because I was in need of it at that time. I live unfortunately, a very kind of frenzied life. I'm very busy at the university. I'm busy with my family. I have a spouse and 3 children.
Yeah, it's a big job.
Yeah, and so when I welcome this as such a gracious opportunity. So I was so looking forward to it that I didn't feel like I needed to prepare myself for some kind of shock. I was more like looking forward to a refuge, and it really was that kind of a thing for me. And going back to my students, I want to challenge them that there are discoveries that you can't have any other way than learning how to be alone with yourself and to spend some quiet moments where you are withdrawn from so many sources of constant stimulation, and you don't know what the benefits of that could be until you try it. And most of them then many of them do respond to challenges like that, and they want to say, okay, well, what is it really about? And maybe there's something to this. And but I would that's why I think contemplative outreach is important, because now more than ever, maybe in our secular world that is saturated with so many opportunities for distraction, it's very hard to get us to be centered.
The other thing is coming out of the elementary school training that I've had, and also a disposition to work with very young students. When I first started my professional life, and of course I've moved through the ranks, all ages now, and corporate and so forth, but I tend to mother hen a little bit about young people being on their own. But on the other hand, I think what you're saying, the challenge, is brilliant, because that is a way of engaging them in the opportunity and letting them create the boundaries, as opposed to all or nothing. You know, you're totally alone in the middle of nowhere, or you're surrounded by mother hens, so to speak. So there must be a balance, and I think the good judgment of the student would be a good rule.
Right.
But the other thing I was going to ask, or maybe ask you to comment on, and that has to do with prayer, because the idea that we're useless, you know, the saying, being so heavenly minded that we're no earthly good. That's the attitude I heard you describing.
Yeah,
that they might have.
That's the attitude that I heard from some of them.
Yeah. But I mean, then the question or the issue is, do you believe in the power of prayer?
That's right.
Because that's what these monks are contributing, and I believe, this is just a personal belief, that when one prays profoundly, whether it's in a community or corporal setting or alone, one contributes to the peace and the healing of the whole world.
I agree with you.
So that's where I would say a challenge to a young person or any person. Okay, try for the day to say a little psalm, or maybe one, the Lord is my shepherd, just that. You know, some people don't take to the Jesus prayer. They don't like it. Right. Even Christians I've known some that have bristled. Right. But that doesn't mean one can't pray something.
Absolutely.
How do you think students would react to that?
Well, I think that, you know, for the more empiricist-minded among them, you can always appeal to the ample studies that are being done on how, the positive psychological and health benefits of meditation, and that these, people are using these in prison environments to reduce violence and all sorts of things. So you can, for those who need some kind of quantifiable, measurable proof, you can say, well, look, it is useful. It is useful in this measurable way. But many of my students also respond to, Aristotle's notion of, he distinguishes between, why things are good. Some things are externally good as a means to some further end, but the better things in life that are internally good are not used for any other purpose, really. They don't serve a purpose for something beyond themselves. Right. And worship, prayer, in a way, is something that's done for the pure joy of it.
Right, for the pure joy of it is right. And the other thing, I was reading something yesterday, John Vianney, the Cure of Ours. I think that's his tag there. He makes the point that when we are praying profoundly, the insights are from within to within. So in other words, there's nothing coming from outside at all. And that, I think, that idea from within to within is very alluring, I would think it's alluring to me. I trust that completely. But I think it would be very alluring to a young person who hadn't experienced it.
Absolutely.
that idea,
Right.
or any person. Which, and the final thing I just wanted to say and ask you about is, to what extent is contemplative life an issue of maturity? Not age necessarily, not chronological age, but a kind of subjective maturity. Is there such a thing? I would ask you about that.
I don't know. That's a really good question.
Like the old soul.
Yeah. And I don't know if I would want to use the word maturity or temperament or kind of personality type. That's a hard one for me to answer. I do think that there are people who are more naturally disposed toward contemplation than others are.
Yes.
Whether I could attribute that to... But I do understand what you mean by the phrase, like an old soul or some kind of sense of
that goes
maturity.
to your point, though, because there are some children.
Yeah, who can do it quite easily. Yeah.
I interviewed many for the book Spiritual Intelligence, and one of my publishers offered me a letter or a little something his 8-year-old daughter wrote, and where she said she wanted to be a saint.
Yeah, wonderful.
Already, and I have a friend who's a cloistered nun who, when she was a young girl, dreamt the same dream, something like that. So a similar kind of thing. In her case, I think Jesus came at the foot of the bed and said, "This is the life you're going to have. It's with me."
Wow.
And that's the life she has. So that old soul business, maybe that's what I mean by maturity. That there's something ripe already,
right?
In that person that gets it.
Yes, yeah.
And maybe they are strange. We are. So, well, what else? Anything else to add? Because I think we've probably given our listeners a lot of food for thought.
Well, I'm really appreciative of Marsha, of the work that you're doing, especially because I think whatever we can do for contemplative outreach is a wonderful thing. I think our world is in dire need of reclaiming a kind of contemplative center.
Right.
So this is important,
thank you.
and I thank you.
I thank you so much. It's been a very interesting turn in the road for me the last 10 years or so. So it means a great deal to talk to someone that has a heart for, as I say, for these values and the life itself. And even in the midst of your being a parent and a husband and a professor and a member of your community, I would have to say, just from what I hear, I'm sure our listeners would agree that you are and are going to add so much to the depth that people have, just the value that they put on these issues, whether it be in a religious sense and vocabulary or just appreciation for life itself, which is, to me, the same thing.
Thank you very much.
I thank you very much, and we'll talk soon.
We thank Professor Joseph Rabb for sharing his time and expertise with us in making this recording. Professor Rabb holds a Ph.D. in theology and is currently Associate Professor of Religious Studies at Siena Heights University in Michigan. He is co-editor of the Merton Annual, lectures regularly for the St. Meinrad School of Theology in Southern Indiana, and received the Center's 2011-2012 Telio Scholars Award in Contemplative Studies. Joe lives in Michigan with his wife Jane and their 3 children.